One cannot help but be engulfed with a deep sense of shame on how today's African Americans have turned into a huge embarrassment for the black race, as they have become a people without direction, morals, and a sense of determinations, unlike those of the earlier ages. As a black person myself, but from the mother continent of Africa, I see today's African Americans as a bunch of crybabies who have an excuse for every type of demented behavior that they exhibit, hiding behind their supposed repression by the white majority. Granted, we all do acknowledge that African Americans have, ever since being dragged to the New World as slaves until today, have been receiving the short and dirty end of the stick, but that is not an excuse for who they have turned out to be. Is being oppressed, or not seeing much prospects for acceptance or opportunities, a valid enough excuse not to attend school, yet those schools are there, or for drug abuse, violence and gangsterism, promiscuity, and generally living below one's potential? As much as I understand the Black Lives Matter mantra, considering that an African American is indeed most likely to be shot by police than a white person, but, without honest reflection, this cause is a lost one. Quite frankly, African Americans are victims of their own failure to rise above the segregation and oppression they have been subjected to over the past centuries. If they believe that the violent repression that they have suffered has turned them into violent people, then they only have themselves to blame when every police officer is jittery around them and has a finger ready on the trigger. It is no secret that one is more likely to be robbed or killed by an African American than a white person, and that so-called black neighborhoods are the most dangerous in the U.S. I am also sure that African Americans themselves acknowledge this fact, and if asked, they would admit that it was safer to walk in a white neighborhood, especially at night. According to some research I did, African American women felt safer dating or marrying a Caucasian man than a fellow brother, as they were less likely to be violent, or to be involved in some sort of crime, especially gangsterism and drugs. African American children were more likely to grow up being raised by a single mother, as their black fathers would be absent, either having absconded their duties, imprisoned for crimes they committed, or dead, usually due to a life of crime. Despite schools, no matter how substandard they may be, being present within reasonable distances, African American children are more likely to drop out, or generally be a nuisance and downright problematic, leading to a higher probability of failure. African American children would rather spend their time with pants pulled down acting all tough, and generally preparing themselves to be criminals and losers. If African Americans want a lot to change, they cannot expect white people to do it for them. It never happened, it is not happening, and it will never happen. Today, what is needed is not another civil rights activist like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or a militant as Malcolm X, or another Rosa Parks. These great heroes did their part for a particular period, and a particular purpose, in African Americans' history. However, today, the biggest struggle for U.S. blacks is not slavery, or segregation, but a serious need for mindset change amongst the African American community itself. They need to make up their minds on what they really want to achieve as a community. What do they truly want? There is nothing that African Americans have gone through that we in Africa have not, but we largely reacted differently. We were similarly enslaved through colonialism, and were subjected to the same violent and dehumanizing oppression and deprivation of world-class education, quality health, economic opportunities and empowerment, suffrage, and were generally relegated to the fringes of human society. However, did that get us down? Did that turn us into violent drug addicts, who waste their time in some pity party, whilst dropping out of school and choosing a life of crime? Did that turn us into unreliable husbands and fathers, who would not be there for our families? On the contrary, Africans were so hungry for education, as we knew it was the key out of poverty, that even during the colonial times, we would walk, if not run, over 20 kilometers each day to and fro school. From as young as 12 years old, my mother would run behind her father, who would be riding a bicycle carrying her boarding school luggage, for nearly 15 kilometers from her rural village to the nearest train station. Even today, as most parts of our continent are still grossly underdeveloped, pupils as young as 12 years have to travel each day more than 10 kilometers to school. We know the education systems in most parts of Africa leave a lot to be desired, as there are no books, and pupils learn under trees. Even in rain, there are no qualified teachers, and some even have to cross flooded rivers in times of rain, but such has not deterred us to crave education. That is why a huge number of Africans are highly educated today. Not only that, but also value the importance of hard work and perseverance. No wonder, when these Africans come to the US, they take up high positions, whilst African Americans will be acting all tough and cool on the streets shooting cocaine and each other. We also have had it tough from the days of white colonialism to today, when we still have to survive under the most unlivable and inhospitable conditions, but we always manage to stay relatively morally upright, determined to succeed, and persevering. Admittedly, Africa has its violent hotspots. However, these are largely geopolitical matters that we also seriously need to sort out ourselves, but, as communities, and individuals, we have managed to hold our own. We understand how a vicious cycle of poverty, drugs, violence and crime would leave us in a trap, thus, we will do our best not involve ourselves in such. Similarly, African Americans need to know that the only key to their success and emancipation is with themselves. It is not with some Black Lives Matter mantra going around the streets demanding not to be shot by the police, but for African Americans to start by taking themselves seriously for a change. Yes, clamoring for one's human rights is very important, I should know, as a social justice activist, but we do not hide our irresponsible behavior and lack of accountability under a shroud of activism. We are very clear on what are our rights, and what are our responsibilities. These need to balance. Start by choosing to have a sense of self-respect and value, embracing education, and choose a straight, honest life free of gangsterism, drugs and violence. Even if it may appear as if there are no career prospects for black people, no matter how educated, they should learn from us Africans. We have learned to survive, without the need for crime. We have become innovative in our self-empowerment ventures, in the midst of poverty and oppression, such that we manage to eke out a decent livelihood. That is why, when we come to the US, we also manage to convert that business innovativeness, which we would have learned in the midst of nothing, into very successful enterprises. I do not have to rob my neighbor just because I am struggling. Therefore, as African Americans come out of Black History Month, it is time that they stopped blaming everyone around them for their own shameful behavior, and acknowledged that the change they seek will largely come from themselves through a mindset change, and not from White House. Degree Tendai Ruben Mabofana is a social justice activist, writer, author, and speaker. He is the program's director with the Zimbabwe Network for Social Justice, ZimJustice. Please call, WhatsApp, 263,782,283,975, or email protected. Please also, like, the ZimJustice page on Facebook. Post published and featured.